The Echo Chamber, brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman from The Holmes Report, joined today from New Zealand by Enero Non-Executive Director David Brain. David, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Very well indeed. How are you?
I'm good, David. I am glad we're talking because we are going to discuss what has widely been described as a car crash interview, perhaps the worst of its kind. And indeed, we are, of course, talking about Prince Andrew's interview with Emily Maitlis on BBC Newsnight. You have written a very good column which explores some of the just baffling decisions and indeed the public relations implications behind this interview. Now, as someone that has worked on many interviews and facilitated interviews and media trained people, and as a connoisseur of the media interview, David, is this the worst you've ever seen?
Well, it's one of the worst, for sure. I can't think of another one that's been this bad for a long time. Probably the CEO of BP during the Mexico oil spill, when he said that he was stressed and needed some time off, and a couple of days later was seen skippering his big yacht around the pristine waters of the South Coast, which just threw into stark relief the waters of the of the Florida coast, which were inundated with the oil from his own disaster. So that's the one that I go back to as being almost as bad. But the issue for this one is just the timing and the context of what it means for the royal family, I think.
Indeed. So, yes, that's an interesting angle. And you are, of course, an arch-royalist. Are you not, David?
No, as you know, I'm actually a Republican, which is a very much a minority view in the UK. Last survey I saw, something like a third of the country was in support of the notion that we should have an elected head of state, as opposed to what we currently have, which is somebody drawn from the very narrow gene pool of the Windsor family.
Yes, and certainly on the evidence of this interview, it doesn't seem like that gene pool has done Prince Andrew any favours.
No, I mean, I would posit that the gene pool is pretty shallow.
Okay, so let's break down this interview then. At what point do you start to think that Prince Andrew is having problems? I mean, is it from the beginning? Is it his appearance and presentation and the way that he's answering questions? Is that starting to raise red flags?
Well, I think the underlying thing in this is his behaviour, and if we think about the interview and the subject matter that it covers, I believe that as far as the royal family is concerned, that actually PR is their fundamental skill, and that they are in their positions because they have largely successfully managed to convince the British public that they're likeable, that they have a role, that they stand for something, that they're a symbol of some values that are very important to a lot of people in the UK, and even me as a Republican can see that. So just Andrew's behaviour, and certainly over the last few years, where he has spent a lot of time consorting with people that anybody would think were in contrast to those values, and obviously standing head and shoulders above, all of the dodgy businessmen that he does spend time with is Jeffrey Epstein, and now dead, committed suicide. Before that, a convicted paedophile, and somebody who even after his conviction, Andrew was still consorting with. So underlying all this is bad judgment, and my issue is obviously the interview, but the fact that Andrew didn't have strong enough people around him to be able to front him up with his behaviour, to shine a light on the quality of the people that he was consorting with, and suggest to him that if not now, then sometime in the future, this sort of issue that he's come into was surely inevitable. So I just don't think he had the advisors around him.
Yeah. I mean, it is remarkable. I read one account that he actually thought the interview went well. Afterwards, and it's only in the ensuing coverage, I think, that the full gravity of the situation has hit them. And in fact, I actually read today that he's considering doing another interview. I mean, I don't know what your view on that would be.
No, he should. To clarify the first one, no. Look, I mean, unless he has a better story to tell, and unless he can, and underlying all this, of course, is that the crimes that Epstein was found guilty of, being a paedophile, trafficking in underage girls, were really, really serious, and he hurt a lot of people. And the first thing Andrew would needed to do if he was going to do this interview at all, was to recognise that and to convey his contrition for having been involved with such a person, and definitely to have apologised for the fact that even after Epstein was found guilty in a US court, that still Andrew was conspiring with him and was being seen publicly with him, which, for a lot of Epstein's victims could have meant, well, look, this guy has done these terrible things to me, and yet he's still being sought out and spending, one of the princes of England is spending time with him, and that kind of whitewashes Epstein's reputation to some extent, or at least shines a good light on it, and that must have affected the victim. So Andrew could quite easily have apologised, and that would not have affected any legal case that he may or may not face from the woman who claims that he had sex with her.
Yeah, indeed. I think Prince Andrew's continued presence with Epstein confers a sort of respectability on Epstein. And like you said, wouldn't have been difficult to make some sort of an apology to say that he completely misjudged the situation, and he's trying to do whatever he can to make it better. But we didn't get that at all. There wasn't a single apology in the whole interview. Instead, we had just really weird obfuscation. There was the claim that he was too honourable. Then there were the really weird stuff that he doesn't sweat. He only wears suits in London. Is only into public hugging. Doesn't know where the bar is at Tramps in Mayfair. I mean, I've never been in Tramps in Mayfair, and I'm pretty sure I can figure out where the bar is.
Well, I have actually, and it's not very big. That's all I remember, and so it would be quite difficult to not see the bar for sure.
So, sorry, are you saying you've been in Tramps in Mayfair and you know where the bar is?
I have been in Tramps in Mayfair, and it's not a big club, so it would be impossible to avoid the bar.
So there's that. Then, of course, there's the famous Pizza Express visit in Woking, which is another just really weird, sort of disingenuous. I guess it's an exercise in disingenuity, if that's actually a word.
Yeah, I mean, it's mistake upon mistake. So the first mistake, behaving badly. The second mistake, believing that you can go into an interview to sort of draw a line under this, either without a compelling narrative that clears your name, and two, without recognising the human implications of what Epstein has done, and not be prepared to make an apology. So those are the basic faults, I think, in this, and then you can layer in other ones. So if you let's say you were going to make an apology, and let's say you did have a compelling narrative, picking Newsnight, that's sort of that's walking into the jaws of some of the best trained journalists on the planet who've got proper researchers and will have forensically been through everything. And maybe there were softer targets from media for him to sort of pick off and tell his story, if you like. But so there's another fault. And then it didn't look to me like he'd done much training in this either, because, you're quite right. Any PR person worth their salt will have said, well, look, if you're going to talk about Pizza Express, that's really quite weird, and, that will set off social memes. The sweating thing will set off social memes. People can work out that it doesn't actually rule you out of being tramps at a tramps nightclub that night if you took your daughters to Pizza Express at between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon that day. It's it's 30 miles away. It's not hard. So there is almost a total lack of good behaviour, a total lack then of understanding of how the world will view how he's behaved, a total lack of preparation then for the interview and the story that you're going to tell, a lack of training to be able to deliver that story properly, and then an understanding as the interview is going on that you need to be reacting and hearing what you're saying and maybe changing tack from that. And I mean, the weird thing to me was looking at him at the end of it. It looked to me, he never panicked. He looked like he was a man who felt that he was performing well.
Yeah, it really raised questions about the environment in which he lives, I think. It struck me as someone who's not himself questioned a lot. And, perhaps these kinds of responses are the kinds of things he's been able to get away with, for years by saying these kinds of things and actually not being questioned on it. He wasn't ready, like you said, for the harsh glare of media scrutiny that is brought on by a program like Newsnight.
No.
But surely he should have been, right? I mean, the Royals are no strangers to this kind of scrutiny in this day and age.
No, and look, and normally they have some of the best advisors up close and personal with them. And, he had obviously parted ways with Jason Stein, who went a couple of weeks before. And you can imagine that if Prince Andrew was insisting on doing this interview, that Stein's reputation would have been at risk, and he took the smart move and thought, well, the hell with that, I'm gone. But I mean, I think what this does for our industry, it sort of throws into stark relief the need for strong senior PR counsel with public figures and CEOs of important companies, because they are public figures. And one of the key skills of a PR person is to be able to sort of hold up a mirror to the CEO or the organisational leader, Prince in this case, and tell him or her how the world really does view them and the behaviour that's under question. And that can be quite hard because, all CEOs to some extent live in the bubble. I mean, certainly the ones that run the bigger organisations. They've probably been paid an awful lot of money for a long time. They have people around them who are very much doing their will. Many of them have got the sort of personalities that don't always brook being told contradictory messages or that they're not the greatest thing very well. It's the strongest PR people are the ones that can stand up to that, have the tact, diplomacy and personal relationship to be able to say, hey, look, bullshit, this is how the world currently sees you. And if you behave in this way, this is how it will be viewed and this is the impact on the organisation. Andrew didn't have, as Jason Stein had gone, anybody around him like that, which I find remarkable.
See, that is something I wanted to ask you about. I mean, let me put it a different way. How improved would you say the royal family PR operation is today compared to, say, 10, 15 years ago? Do they kind of demonstrate the kind of public relations that could stand up with the biggest clients in the business?
Well, they used to. So if you, this has been a pretty horrible year for them with, the two with Meghan and Harry and Wills and Kate apparently being at loggerheads and going their sort of separate ways on message. But up until a year ago, look, yeah, I mean, I think from the days of the aftermath of Diana's death, and when the Queen and the royal family realised that they'd misread the public view then, and as we all know, famously, Tony Blair had to step in and force the Queen to come down to London and to show sorrow and regret for the death of Diana. After that, they really got their act together. Prince Charles has hired a series of very good people. Dickie Arbiter, famously ran that whole operation very successfully for many years. But I think as the Queen and her sort of central coordination of proceedings as sort of, she's older and moving off centre stage, it's become much more difficult for them to coordinate. So I think they've had a horrible year. But up until last year, this year, they've done pretty well. They're pretty sophisticated. So how they could have let Andrew wander into this situation with nobody around him advising him of seniority is remarkable, really.
Yeah, I mean, how does that happen? I don't know. Is there a structure? This isn't a conventional company, is there? There's no PR function. I mean, do they operate, independently? Does each royal have their own PR staff?
They do. They have their own PR staffs, but it used to be sort of run and coordinated. I mean, this isn't yes, it's a royal family, so it's different to everything else. But in some senses, if you look at the way in which political communications organises itself, Alistair Campbell, famously, for example, instituted the grid, where he coordinated the communications outputs of all the different ministries to make sure that there was a concerted on-message picture portrayed of New Labour through the Blair years, that made the most of every announcement that was to be made, that didn't, made sure on a tactical level that two ministries weren't making important announcements at the same time, and that their messaging laddered up to something that talked about progress in the right way for New Labour. That sort of function seems to be missing at the moment in the royal family.
Mm. And like you said in your column, this is what they do. They don't have a product or a service to sell. This isn't Tony Hayward, who's an oil man, claiming he wants his life back. These are people whose really only function is, in a way, public relations. It's to win over public opinion.
Yeah, I mean, they operate because the public thinks they stand for something important in the country, and that they are people to be looked up to. I mean, that's the whole notion of royalty. Obviously, they are different to us. And, it's literally, we are expected to look up to them, to their behaviours and to the values that they symbolise. They don't have any way to manage that other than through PR tactics. They can't write policy. There's no product or service that they can improve or launch to make our lives better. The product is them and their behaviour. That's PR. And so to go into this situation without a high caliber PR person is, it's gross negligence by Andrew. And the issue, of course, is that, we are getting to a time when, to put it politely, we're going to go through transition. The Queen won't last forever and Charles will ascend to the throne, and there'll be a whole new focus then on the royal family. Much of the reverence for the royal family in the UK and abroad is tied up in respect for the Queen, and even, me as a Republican, you can't help but admire how she has run things and performed herself over the years. So when she goes, there will be a new light and a new judgment, even by people who are monarchist, about the appropriateness of that institution as heads of state for the UK. So it's really important at this time that they have their act together.
Mm. Indeed. I mean, it without wanting to underplay the gravity of the situation, and then in a way that's the real shame here. They are, of course, the real victims here. Which another of the most remarkable things about this interview was Prince Andrew seemed to see himself as the only victim. In this entire situation, but it has really turned him into a laughing stock, and as you mentioned, all the memes, these are going to run for, it's just manna from heaven, really.
Well, it is. I mean, he was always Randy Andy because he'd been seen in nightclubs, but there was a degree of sort of, well, that's okay. He's a young prince. That's what he does. And then when he got married, there was a degree to which there was a fondness for him and Fergie before they dropped the ball on that. But I don't think he will ever recover from this. And by the way, this interview now is just the start of it, because what charities are going to want him on their board, on the letterhead. We're already seeing some of them begin to move away. What businesses? He's got that organisation that helps sort of tech entrepreneurs.
Pitch at Palace.
Yeah.
I think KPMG has already distanced itself from Pitch at Palace. I think it says a lot when KPMG is distancing itself from you.
Yeah, and you know he knows nothing about tech businesses. Obviously, his whole notion is to put a patina and a respectability over that organisation and bring people together. And if actually his image and reputation now is forcing people away, he cannot do his job. So that's happening. But more interestingly, I was looking, this morning at the Times and the Daily Mail, not the two most left-wing or Republican-leaning of publications, and they are both putting people onto the money. So now you've got stories running about how does he live this lifestyle given the income that he's got. So it's what he's done with this interview is that he's made himself a legitimate target of even normally monarchy supporting media. There's blood in the water, and I think the story will run and run.
So what's the public relations playbook here? I mean, we're already, I think, seeing the Queen. I mean, obviously not directly, but the Queen's people, let's say, distancing themselves from this interview.
Yes.
I mean, what is the kind of playbook here? Is there a way out?
Well, he's got two choices, really. The first thing he needs to do is he needs to, if not convince Jason Stein to come back and help him, he needs someone in there to come and help him. And it's not just about what he does now, about does he do another interview or whatever. It is about, a commitment from him never to be seen consorting with people like this man again. And by the way, he's not the only person of sort of slightly strange and background that Andrew spends time with. He's got to clean up his act. That's the first thing, and he has to begin to act like a royal. I mean, they all do to some extent, and the Queen's got to set a very high bar for that. They all have to get their act together in that respect. But if he is to do or say anything in the next days or weeks to redress all of this, he has to apologise for consorting with Jeffrey Epstein. He has to apologise and show sympathy for the victims of Epstein, and he has to apologise for consorting with the man after he was found guilty of these terrible crimes.
Yeah, he spent 4 days at his house in New York, and that was to break up with him.
Yes.
Because it was a convenient place to stay, apparently.
Yeah, because the hotels are not also very convenient. I mean, there's just no credibility in all of that.
Yeah, it is totally incredible. It is a car crash and a train wreck. Will the PR industry be using this interview in its media training manuals for years to come? I
think so. Look, one of the great things about this as a training piece of material for the PR industry is that when you go into train clients, you often do scenario planning, so it's not just about training them for the interview, but you sort of picture the scenario, so the strategic context and backdrop to this, which in this case would be the royal family and the fact they're going into transition, and then talk about the options that are available to somebody in an Andrew's position, and you can then role play about, well, what is the PR strategy for this? And then finally get to, the interview itself. And the beauty of this case study is because it's so famous and we all know it now, it'll be easy for people to, to convey and get interest in.
Well, I suppose that's not really a silver lining for Andrew, that
no.
this interview will help the PR industry and perhaps help clients and in the future. But it's something. Just wanted to come back. So did you say the guy who ran the royal PR operation, his name was Dickie Arbiter?
Yes, that was a long time ago.
Arbiter, that's a great name for a PR person.
It is.
It is. That's wonderful. That's really nominative determinism at play.
It is.
So we had a chat separately about some of the great interviews. We were discussing this one. And, I think this goes right in at the top. But for listeners who are perhaps looking for other classics of this genre, are there any others you would advise in terms of how not to do it?
The Tony Hayward BP Gulf of Mexico one absolutely is brilliant. The Sainsbury's the Sainsbury's, the UK retailer, the CEO who was caught just before the interviews talking about we're in the money when he's talking about results and then we're talking about prices in the stores is a really once you go into a studio you get mic'd up. The mic is never off, and there's lots of incidents like that, I think.
Of course, top mic. There's my favourite. This will be a little obscure for our US listeners, but Joe Kinnear. I think you're familiar with this one from the sports pages. I think when he took over as Newcastle, I think it was director of football, or maybe it was manager, I can't remember. 5 or 6 years ago, turned the air blue at his first press conference.
Yes.
Anyone who wants to listen to that one, definitely, it's probably not safe for work.
Unless you've got your headphones in. No, I mean, there was a couple of journalists who turned up for a press conference and he took exception to some stories that they had written. And he basically, in what he thinks is before the press conference starts, unleashes the most foul-mouthed tirade at these guys, threatening them legally and calling them every word under the sun just before the press conference. Unfortunately for him, the whole thing was recorded and then released afterwards. Yeah.
I mean, it's so bad, that one, that it's actually really good.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And, obviously the stakes on that one, and indeed on some of these examples, you see the stakes are much lower. I mean, the stakes couldn't really have been a lot higher than they were for Prince Andrew at this one. It's not like Joe Kinnear's entire reputation was at stake, like it is here.
No. There are some other classic examples as well of, journalists are people too, and agreeing to go do an interview, maybe in a crisis or issue situation, is always high risk. You never entirely know how it's going to turn out. And CEOs or the people who are going to do the interview are humans, and sometimes they lose a nerve. I mean, some of the worst things I've seen is where people have been empty-chaired. They've said that they were going to turn up for an interview, change their mind for good or bad reason beforehand, and then get empty-chaired by the journalist. I think sometimes as well, those examples of people walking out, rarely does that work for the person who walks out. Occasionally it does if you've got incredibly hectoring or lecturing journalists, but that's also, there's some good examples of that.
Yeah, there's I think there's Russell Crowe. I seem to recall him walking out during a film review where the reviewer asked him about his accent. I think it was in the Robin Hood movie.
Right.
And asked him, apparently didn't think his accent was, let's say, the purest Nottinghamshire or South Yorkshire. I don't want to get into a big debate on where Robin Hood is from. That will enrage many of our listeners in that part of England. There's the Bee Gees walking out on Clive Anderson. Don't know if you remember that one.
No, I don't. But that's
that's a good 20, 25 years ago. I remember watching that one live, and that was kind of amazing.
Yeah, I think sort of it's different for celebrities. I think. I mean, we don't owe them anything. They're not in public office or running anything big other than starring in movies. And sometimes for celebrities, musicians, it's possibly not bad to be seen as slightly crazy. I think doing that sort of thing, if you're the CEO or you hold public office, is another thing, though.
Yeah, really good point, actually. I think, you're right. Celebrities can kind of get away with it. And then, of course, there's Gerald Ratner.
So Gerald,
that was...
Yeah. So again, for those, this is another British example where Ratner's was one of the, I think probably the biggest high street jeweller in the UK. It was a huge business, very sort of low-end jeweller, but very, very successful, run by a brilliant CEO called Gerald Ratner, who, in not really pressed, but almost voluntarily in a TV interview, described one of his sort of new range. I think it was a sort of a silver-plated tray or something as crap. He described his own product as crap. And of course, what that meant to everybody who'd ever bought anything from Ratner's was, look, we're idiots, and this guy has been selling us, at his own admission, crap for all those years. And the business subsequently, well, I mean, over a period of as little as 6 months, I think, just collapsed. So from
that has to be the most devastating. If you really want a good example of the cost of a bad interview, I think Gerald Ratner's has got to be up there. Can't think of, Tony Hayward's was bad, but it didn't end BP.
It didn't end. It didn't end BP. I mean, it took. I mean, share price of what it took BP down compared to the whole value of Ratner's would have been larger. But yeah, Ratner's is the most where a business disappeared because of a TV interview that wasn't even an issue in crisis at the time, but the interview was so bad that the business disappeared.
Yeah, I think more recently I'd probably point to Travis Kalanick as a good example of someone who, I don't think it was any one particular interview, but certainly his public appearances really hurt Uber and hurt the business, and to the extent that they had to get rid of him and now implement a big turnaround plan and a big effort to win back public support. So the lesson here, as always, is hire a good PR person.
Hire a good PR person, behave appropriately within the values of your company or organisation to start with, because then you won't have as many of these issues. But hire somebody who challenges you, has been through these circumstances before, is strong enough as an individual to face CEO and C-level and board level people down with the often painful truth, and then brings in the people with the broadcast and media expertise to train you to be able to go through the experience.
It's interesting the point you made, behave appropriately within the values of your organization, which I think for corporates is, it's fundamentally sound advice. Now, with the royal family, are there question marks around the values of that organization? I mean, are they clearly defined? Do they need to be better defined? What are they?
Well, you're asking a Republican. Look, I think in the hearts and minds of many people in the UK, well, the majority of people in the UK, the royal family stands for a quintessential part of British values, and they would not see those values as being aligned to spending time with a proven paedophile, to go back to our example. And I think whilst they're humans and they lead their own lives, many of the royal family make a lot of effort to live up to those values. And as I said, the Queen has set a very high benchmark for that. So, yeah, they probably don't have it set down in a manual, and maybe they need a modern day comms person to go in and kind of do the sort of stuff that we would do in a firm. So set down, the values and the behaviour norms that we expect, and literally have people, as you do in many corporations, have to sign up to those code of ethics, those modes of behaviour.
Yeah, I think they need a Republican to do it, David. I mean, who better to really, hold up the mirror?
I'm afraid I would probably be working to bring them down from the inside.
Yeah, quite possible. Well, I think, they've had spies in their midst before.
Well, yeah, and maybe Agent Andrew is in fact the most effective Republican in the country.
Well, I think we can all agree that Andrew's behaviour, it just doesn't align with, the values of any kind of sort of civilised public figure. It's what you would expect, I think. And yeah, that is the real shortcoming here. The interview has, as you've said, created a reputational tailspin. But yes, it all begins with his behaviour. Well, thank you very much, David. This was an interesting conversation. It will be fascinating, actually, to see what happens next, whether there will be another interview from Prince Andrew, and indeed how the royal family, Buckingham Palace, how they, I suppose, limit the damage here.
Yeah, he needs to apologise unreservedly.
Great, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.